So right now I have the camera in the 1-point autofocus. I'm running this in 4K. So hopefully this has me in focus. I find that when you're using 1-point autofocus, it does an okay job, but if you're moving out of frame, if I come back, I don't even know if it did anything, but so it's not really responsive when you're in 4K, but this lens does help because it has an STM motor and it does focus pretty quickly. That's a plus for this, having the kit lens with this camera. Some of my third-party glass, I have a Tamron 28-75. This is a much better lens. You're gonna notice when you're using better lenses that they do have better contrast. They're much sharper than your kit lens on the camera. That was something that I didn't believe for a while. I was always very ignorant. I said, I'm just gonna use the kit lens on my camera, and you're not getting the most out of your camera when you use the kit lens, but I don't think this is a terrible kit lens. So today we're just gonna discuss the video features, as I'm not really a photographer. I don't take that many pictures with this camera, so we're just gonna talk about the videography of this camera. Let's get into it. So first thing I wanna talk about is the 4K of this camera. It does record at 120 megabits per second. That's okay. I find that there's a lot of rolling shutter in 4K, so if you're someone that does quick pans with the camera, be very careful. This is something comparable to some of the Sony cameras like the a6400. It's pretty much getting the same rolling shutter as that camera, so you want to make sure that you're using this camera on a tripod in 4K and 1080p. I'll have two pieces of footage on the screen. There's no rolling shutter at all, or at least there's very minimal rolling shutter. You won't find any problems filming in 1080p. I do find in 4K that there is a little bit more noise in the footage because it is cropped into the sensor. We are shooting at a 1.7 times crop, so when you shoot in 1080p, you have no crop. What this means is when you are punched into the sensor, you are not gathering as much light, so you will notice more noise in the shadows. So any black in the footage is gonna look a little bit noisier. Keep in mind you're going to be getting less bokeh in the background, the depth of field that you get when you're shooting closer to subjects, because now with the 1.7 times crop, you are further away from the subject. So 4K with the kit lens, I find it to work okay when I'm using my third-party glass, such as my Tamron, which uses an older autofocusing system. This thing is very noisy, so I don't recommend it for video, but I do find that this just gets locked up. Since this uses an old motor, it'll just get locked up, and it's not very pleasant. Sometimes I have to go back and then just turn my focus ring a little bit just so that way it's not stuck. So if you're gonna be using 4K on this camera, I recommend using manual focus if you do need this camera for 4K, but I really don't recommend it. You're probably gonna wanna spend some more money on some of the higher end cameras if you need 4K that have autofocus. Because if you're filming yourself, it does get annoying having to go back and forth between the camera. In this video, I am shooting in 1-point autofocus, so I'm hoping that I'm in focus most of the time. And if I am, props to the RP, but it's not reliable at all. So next on the list, I want to talk about the autofocus. When you're shooting in 1080p, this camera just nails it in autofocus. When your subject is in the frame, it's gonna go right to the eye first. If it's too far away, it might go to the face. If it's extremely far away, it might do like a zone autofocus. It might just show a box. But I do find that when you're shooting at closed-in apertures like f7 or above, it does take a little bit more time to focus. I was filming a project a long time ago where I was far away from the camera and I was using the kit lens at around 70 millimeters, and it had a little bit of trouble just focusing on me at times. It was going through zone autofocus, then it went to face, then eye. It was like, I found it to be like pulsing a whole lot. So be careful when you're shooting at closed-in apertures. It could have been also that I was shooting in low light situations, but I was only shooting at around 2500 ISO, around there. I don't understand why that was an issue. Another thing I'm going to talk about is the color that comes out of this camera. I have mixed opinions about it. Depends what color profile you're shooting with. If you're shooting with neutral, I find that it looks okay, but I always turn the contrast all the way down and I +1 on the saturation, and the image does have this very sharpened look, especially if you're using the standard profile. So I like to turn that all the way down and I just go up 2 notches. And this really helps with making the footage look a little bit less digital. But keep in mind, if you do customize the color profile on the camera, you are going to want to add contrast back in post. If you're using DaVinci Resolve, I usually add an about 1.2 to 1.25 of contrast back in the footage, and this really does help with dynamic range in certain cases, but not a whole much. Again, if you want better dynamic range, you're probably going to want to buy a different camera. I find this to be the case with most Canon cameras that don't have the best dynamic range. But I do think the colors are quite pleasing coming out of the camera. And by the way, if you're someone that does want to color grade your footage intensely, you want to adjust the shadows, the midtones, do not do this with this footage. You will ruin the footage because this is an IPB codec. This camera does not have all eye at all. So if you're someone who needs to color grade your footage, you're going to want to look at a different camera. Next topic is the audio. I'm actually quite surprised as to how decent it is. It's not the best, but the preamp out of this camera is quite usable. And you want to use a microphone that has like a 20 plus dB pad. You want to make sure that your preamp is really low on this camera. I usually don't go past the quarter mark. When I was using the Canon SL3, which was the first DSLR that I had, that preamp had a lot of hiss, a lot of humming, and I don't find that to be much of an issue with the RP. Also, we do have a headphone jack on the RP, which is super helpful and helps you listen and monitor to your audio in real time. And this really saves a lot of time in my workflow, so I don't have to go back, listen to the audio, see if it came out right. I could just plug headphones in, put them on, and I can hear how I sound like in real time, which is really cool. On the screen, if you keep pressing the info button, it does show your audio levels on the screen, which is really nice to have. So here we're shooting in 1080p. See, the autofocus is working very effectively. I am using the in-camera sound. So this is how the camera sounds like. And what I really like about this is that you can see the audio levels right here while you are recording. So this is how the audio sounds. I'm not processing the audio. I'm just going to let you hear it like this. I recommend that you manually set your audio even if you do use your in-camera audio, which I never recommend you do. What I usually do is I prefer using a Rode Wireless Go, and I have boomed the Rode Video Mic Pro, and I use the Rode Wireless Go with this, so that way I have a wireless boom setup. Keep in mind though, if you want the best audio quality, you should record externally, so that way you're not depending on your camera's preamp, because they aren't the best preamps. What's nice about this is that you can adjust the audio levels while you are recording. So I can make this louder if I wanted to, and make it quiet. You can bring it back down. You can also adjust your headphone volume as well, which I don't have any headphones plugged in, but this is very helpful. So image stabilization on this camera is okay. It's not the greatest. I find that the optical stabilization coming out of the kit lens isn't the best for vlogging. It does work, but you're definitely going to want to make sure that you hold this camera very steady if you're vlogging with it. Something that I noticed with my EF glass, my Canon 17-35, was when I was just using the first level of digital image stabilization, I found that it worked much better than the optical stabilization alone on the kit lens. Now, the enhanced digital image stabilization comes with a 1.4 times crop, but I find this works very well, but you have to use high shutter speeds. You want to make sure that you're using at least 1/100th of a second, or else you're going to get all these motion artifacts in your footage. So this is the stabilization that you get with the lens. I'm also using the in-camera audio as well. So I'm going to walk around here, turn it around. As you see, it's not bad. It does do the job. And now we're going to just try image stabilization alone. So I have applied image stabilization, the first level, and it might have helped just a little bit. So we have optical stabilization with the lens as well as with the electronic digital image stabilization. Now we have the enhanced versions. As you can see, there is a big crop on the screen, but the stabilization, I find it to be very nice. Although when I do move in and out, there's some additional motion artifacts. So we can turn the shutter speed up a little bit higher. So now we're at 1/100th. So I think this works a lot better. You see, it does have nice auto exposure for your face when you're vlogging. So as you can see, some things are blown out, but for vlogging, this is pretty much what you want. You want your face to be shown. So this is very nice, but it is a little bit tight. So we are in 1080p, and I'll show you how this works with the kit lens in 4K. So now I've switched to 4K, and I'm using eye detection as well as face tracking. And it is very close, and I have no digital image stabilization on. I'm just using the lens. So this is very close. You might make your viewers uncomfortable at times. And if I apply more stabilization, it's just going to get even tighter on the frame. And I don't think it's very usable for vlogging. But I'm going to show you how this works with my 17-35. So now I'm shooting on my other lens. This is at 17mm. I do notice my autofocusing motor going in and out at times, and there might be too much noise going into the audio, might be picked up. But this is a little bit wider, so if you did want to use some 4K vlogging with this camera, you're going to want to be shooting at 16-17mm. If I do apply digital image stabilization, it will crop the image even more. I'm not going to use manual focus. Whoops. What's nice about this is that you do have focus peaking. So you can see I am blue right now, so if you go into the settings you can turn on focus peaking. So I know I am in focus. But keep in mind this lens is not image stabilized, so I do have to go in and enable some digital image stabilization because it does look a little jerky at times. Now I've applied the first level of stabilization, so that way my footage isn't too jerky. Herky-jerky, some people like to call it. I am at a higher shutter speed as well, that way there's no warpiness on the screen. I'm gonna vlog around like this. Again, this is very, oh, I almost fell. This is a little too cropped in for my taste. I'll show you what this looks like in 1080p. So this is how I look like in 1080p. I'm using the same focal length. I have the first level of digital image stabilization, and I have this wide field of view, which is really nice for vlogging. You can see pretty much everything that's around me. I don't even have to hold the camera as far back as I did before. So here's some low light vlogging as well. We're shooting at f2.8, so we will have a little bit better low light performance. So this is really nice. You can see my whole studio here. And this is what vlogging is all about, not being up in your face or anything that makes your viewers uncomfortable. So this is very nice. So now I'm using the same lens at 24mm, which is the widest that your kit lens will go to. And this is still pretty wide in 1080p for vlogging. Not as wide as I'd like it, which is, this is 17. That's 24, so that's the difference right there. Keep in mind when you're vlogging in 1080p, there's no crop when you're shooting video. When you vlog in 4K, you get a 1.7 times crop. So if you're using lenses that aren't even image stabilized, that crop is only gonna get more intense and it's just not wide enough. My thoughts on the lens, I don't like how the aperture isn't a constant f4. It's a cheap lens for a reason. To get into this camera, just to learn how to use the camera. The focal lengths do different things. When you're shooting at 35mm, you're gonna get different distortion. Shooting at 50, you're gonna get different distortion. 70, 80, 90, all these focal lengths do different things. They bring different types of feelings and emotions to your shots. I like full frame cameras because I can shoot longer focal lengths. There's less distortion, almost looks like it's real life. So I'm now shooting at 35, a little bit tighter on the screen. This is the focal length that a lot of YouTubers use for talking head videos. It's a very common focal length. I find that around 50, 70, the image does get a little bit soft. When you're using those focal lengths, you also get a little bit less depth of field, and you're also gonna need more light. So when you're shooting at f5, f6.3, f7, you're gonna need a lot more light, and if you're someone that's just getting into this, you're gonna wanna get some good lighting. This was something that I overlooked when I got my first camera, was I did not have lighting. I also had poor composition skills, and these are all basic things you need. Even before you get nice glass like this, you want to make sure that you have good lighting, because good lighting is going to help the lens perform a lot better. It's going to make your images look sharper when you're shooting at lower ISO. So if you're shooting at high ISO, this camera does look pretty noisy. I find that around 3200 is when this camera is just not usable for me. I find that there's a lot of noise. You also lose a little bit of dynamic range as you get higher in ISO. So I usually try to keep this camera under 1600 ISO if I'm lucky. But I know that if I'm working in low light situations, I try to get this under 3200. If not, I don't like shooting in 6400. I just find it's not usable on this camera. The user interface on this camera is pretty nice. You can change the frame rates right on the screen. You don't have to go into the menu. Even digital image stabilization is right on the screen as well. And this can help make things more time efficient for you. If you're someone that doesn't like going into the menu, hunting for a certain option that you're looking for. I also like how I can change the white balance on the screen as well as the color profiles. And what's also nice is while you're even recording, you can change your audio levels. You can even change the headphone levels if you're someone that's using the headphone jack. This camera is very easy to navigate through. So I'm gonna go ahead and switch over to my 17 to 35 so you can see what that looks like in 4K. You're gonna notice that the image is gonna be a lot sharper and there's gonna be more contrast. Shooting in manual focus because the autofocus will not work on my USM lens. This is a Canon EOS 17-35. It uses an older USM lens, so it's just not working well. So I'm just gonna leave it in manual focus. And by the way, we are shooting at an f2.8 aperture, so you're gonna notice that there's less grain in the image. It's gonna be much sharper. better contrast, more sharpness in the image. This is something I want to talk about, and this is for live streaming as well as external recording. I find this camera to be really nice for live streaming. You're getting a nice wide field of view when you're shooting in 1080p. So if you're shooting in a tight space and you're someone that needs a wider field of view, this is a really nice camera to do that with, because full frame cameras, they don't have a crop factor. So when you're shooting at 24mm, you're getting that exact focal length. If you're using a Canon crop sensor camera, those apply a 1.6 times crop. So if you're shooting on an 18mm lens, your focal length is now 28.8 millimeters. I find that the HDMI connection is all right. I do find that there's like a little bit more noise when you're using the HDMI on this camera. I don't know what it is, I don't like it. And I found the same thing to be on the Canon SL3. I don't know if it's just the HDMI connection on those cameras, but when you're using an external recorder, you only have the option to use 60 frames per second with this camera, which I don't think a lot of people are gonna be just shooting slow motion footage with this camera. I think people want to use 30 frames per second, they're gonna use 24 frames per second. Now, I have found a way where you can shoot 30 frames for using an external recorder, and that is by using a slower shutter speed, such as 1/50th, but then your footage just looks a little bit ghost-like. There's like a little too much motion blur. I don't understand why the camera is restricted to 60 FPS, probably because it's intended more for live streaming, and live streaming, pretty much the standard now is 60 FPS for most live streaming cameras. But if you're someone that's using this for an external recording, just note that there is no 24p in 1080p unless you were to use manual focus and you press the info button a couple times to get rid of some of the overlays, and then you would have to go into the camera and turn off the auto shutdown feature. That's a workaround for it, but it's very disappointing. Now, you can get 24p if you're shooting in 4K, but you lose the autofocus and you also have a 1.7 times crop, so it doesn't make it very practical for using an external recorder. The only reason why I would use an external recorder is so that way I can get over the 30-minute time limit. And one thing I don't like about this camera is that you only have 30 minutes to record, which a lot of cameras are past that at this point. One of the main reasons why you would want to use an external recorder with this camera is to pass the 30-minute time limit, but if there's no 24p, you don't have 30p, I think it's a huge letdown. And no one's going to use the 4K on this camera. Well, most people aren't going to use the 4K on this camera, but there's no autofocus, you have a 1.7 times crop. That's pretty much my biggest complaint with this camera, is the clean HDMI feature just lacks a whole lot. Can't choose your frame rate, and if you do want to shoot 24p, you're limited to 4K. Now, what I recommend that you do with this camera is you do buy it with the kit lens, get good with lighting, get good with your composition. Also get familiar with your style, what videos do you want to upload. So I think if you're an advanced user, someone that's expecting more video features out of the camera, higher bit rate, better codec to work with color grading, better dynamic range, I don't think this is the camera for you. But if you're someone that just wants an easy to use camera, reliable autofocus in 1080p, and with some 4K features, if you're willing to work with the crop, if you have enough space in your room, like I have a lot of space in this room, so I don't mind pushing the camera a little bit further back and then I manually focus it. Most of the time I shoot in 1080p, but if I'm feeling lucky, I might use the 4K just to see how it works. So that's gonna wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and share it with someone that might find it helpful. Anyways, I'll catch you on the next video. Peace out.